Welcome to Rewriting the Past, the history podcast with a difference. We examine a major historical event and then ask ourselves the question, what if it never happened? In this alternative history series, we look at how history could have been very different. If you enjoy the content, then please subscribe. It would be appreciated by our small team here. Let's embark on our alternative event. World War II was a momentous event in the global history of the world, affecting almost all nations and territories. At the end of the conflict, many nations were crippled by economic woes and mourning the loss of citizens and a tearing of the social fabric. There were two major theatres to World War II, the European and the Pacific. Although they intersected on several occasions, it was mainly the Germans who drove the war in Europe and the Japanese who maintained the Pacific campaign. The Americans came into the war late. They decided to enter on the side of the Allies after Japan attacked the American territory of Pearl Harbor, destroying several naval structures and ships. This surprise attack ultimately led to the Americans deciding to enter the war militarily on the side of the Allied powers. They were present in both theatres of conflict and had a monumental impact in ending the war. In our alternative history, we explore what would happen if the Americans decided not to enter the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Instead, the Americans stayed neutral throughout. We'll examine the immediate impact on the course of the war itself and the later years. First, let us review what happened during World War II and beyond in our real timeline. Following the Treaty of Versailles and the economic turmoil of the interwar period, Adolf Hitler's expansionist ambitions led to the outbreak of World War II. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war. The rapid German conquest of Poland showcased blitzkrieg tactics. In 1940, Germany swiftly overran France, leading to the evacuation of British troops from Dunkirk. The Battle of Britain thwarted German plans for invasion. Meanwhile, Japan's expansion in Asia triggered conflict with the United States, culminating in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The war became truly global as Axis powers, including Germany, Italy, and Japan, faced off against the Allies, led by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. Key turning points included the Soviet victory at Stalingrad and Allied successes in North Africa and the Pacific. The D-Day landings in June 1944 marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe, while the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 forced Japan's surrender, ending the deadliest conflict in human history. Now let's explore the consequences of America remained neutral. Looking at the war itself, several things would have changed. Without American intervention, it's likely that Europe would have remained deeply divided between the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Soviet Union, Great Britain, and other Allied nations would have faced an even greater challenge in defeating Nazi Germany without the resources and manpower provided by the United States. There are many who consider that, without American support, the war could not have been won, but this is unlikely to have been the outcome. The Soviet Union had an immense population to call upon, and as Hitler's ill-conceived Eastern attack on Stalingrad showed, conquering Russia is difficult to do. The British Empire, collectively, also had an immense number of soldiers, upwards of 400 million if entirely mobilized. The war would have taken longer and been more bloody, but ultimately would have been won by the Allies. The Americans would have likely still provided support in the form of arms, money and food to the Allies, but no military personnel. The Lend-Lease program was already in effect before Pearl Harbor, and there isn't any reason to think it would not have continued. As mentioned before, the absence of American forces would have prolonged the war, leading to even greater devastation across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Battle of the Atlantic, for instance, would have been more difficult for the Allies without American naval support, potentially delaying the D-Day invasion and the eventual liberation of Western Europe. A longer war would mean more deaths, and would affect the nations involved. It's likely that the war itself, globally, would probably have lasted for another 2 to 3 years longer than it actually did. With the burden of fighting the Axis largely falling on the Soviet Union, they would have likely expanded their influence further into Eastern Europe. The absence of American military aid through the war would have put even greater strain on the Soviet economy and military, but they will still have eventually emerged victorious in Europe. In the Pacific theater, without the United States to oppose them, Japan would have continued its aggressive expansion across Asia. Countries like China and other Southeast Asian nations would have faced even greater hardships under Japanese occupation. The Japanese war machine would have likely pushed all the way to the border of the Soviet Union. It seems unlikely that the Japanese would expand further. Eventually, without the devastation of either the American bombings or the atom bomb, the war in Asia would have been drawn to a conclusion by treaty, in which Japan kept most of the territory it gained. Post-World War II, the global history would have been very different. Very few European countries are able to expand and grow economically or militarily, except the Soviet Union, who, with their industrial machine coupled with a large population, see an opportunity to expand. With limited resistance from Western nations and the United States, the Soviet Union and Japan would dominate the middle part of the century. In the years following the war, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and launched offensives in Manchuria and Korea. Without American pressure in the Pacific, the Soviet Union has been able to exert greater influence in these regions and potentially expanded its territorial holdings in Northeast Asia. The Chinese Civil War between the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces led by Mao Zedong was temporarily put on hold during World War II due to the common threat posed by Japan. Without American support for the nationalists, the outcome of this conflict would have been different, potentially leading to a stronger communist China earlier on, able, eventually, to push the Japanese Empire back. Over the decades after the war, it is likely that Japan is unable to hold on to its wartime territories, due mainly to logistics and economic troubles. Even with the war won, Japan struggles to maintain a hold against a growing Soviet Union and China. The role of America after World War II in our alternative history is very different. The United States experienced a significant economic boom during World War II due to the mobilization of industry for wartime production. Without the war, the pace of economic growth might have been slower, although the country would still have benefited from its natural resources and industrial capacity. Prior to entering the war, the United States pursued an isolationist foreign policy, seeking to avoid entanglements in European conflicts. Without the war, this isolationist sentiment might have persisted longer, delaying or preventing American involvement in international affairs. The war had a profound impact on American society, including the mobilization of women into the workforce, the migration of African Americans to industrial centers, and the expansion of federal government powers. Without the war, these social changes would have occurred at a slower pace or taken different forms. American involvement in World War II elevated the country's status as a global superpower. Without the war, The United States might have played a less prominent role in international affairs, although its economic and military power would still have made it a significant player on the world stage. One of the defining moments of World War II was the Manhattan Project, which led to the development of the atomic bomb. Without the urgency of defeating Nazi Germany and Japan, the Allies might not have prioritized the development of nuclear weapons as they did. However, even without participating in World War II, a Cold War would likely begin, with America taking a leading role. More conservative and more protectionist, but still taking a central role. Given the eventual Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the West, it's likely that nuclear weapons would still have been developed independently, leading to a more fragmented and dangerous world. The absence of American involvement in World War II would have also influenced the creation and structure of post-war global institutions. Organizations like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank might have been shaped differently without strong American leadership and influence. The war hastened the decline of colonial empires, as European powers were weakened and their colonies became more assertive in seeking independence. Without American intervention, the process of decolonization might have unfolded differently. European colonial powers might have clung to their possessions longer, leading to prolonged conflicts and altering the course of history in regions like Africa and Asia. World War II spurred significant technological advancements, particularly in aviation, medicine, and communications. Without the war driving these developments, progress in these areas might have been slower or taken different paths. For example, radar technology, jet propulsion, and nuclear energy might not have been as rapidly developed without the urgency of wartime demands. The war had profound cultural and social effects, shaping generations and influencing popular culture. Without American involvement, the shared experience of mobilization, sacrifice, and victory might have been absent in the United States, leading to a different national identity and collective memory. We hope you have enjoyed the episode today. As always, remember that counterfactual histories are only speculation. We examine the historical arc and try to predict a logical pattern. In no way is this material meant to offend or suggest future policies.